Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first program of the new year for the Popular Astronomy Club. We're welcoming the 10 people who are here at Butterworth, and we have about 20 more signed in online, I believe, tonight. So I think some of you are taking advantage of having this on Zoom because we here at Butterworth Center, it just started snowing. So yeah, out of here before it gets too bad anyway. Welcome to those of you on Zoom attending from the other astronomy clubs around the area. And I want to remind you, those at home, to please mute your microphone while we have the main presentation going on here to eliminate any of the background noise we have here. We will have a question and answer period that will be coming up after the presentation. We'll have a chance to interact at that time. Also, we've used the chat function of Zoom sometimes too if you have questions to bring out. We're going to move right away to our feature presentation for tonight. We have Professor Andy Bruno, who's Professor of History and Environmental Studies at Northern Illinois University. He's the author of Tunguska, A Siberian Mystery and Its Environmental Legacy, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. Professor Andy Bruno will explore the mystery of the 1908 explosion that devastated a wide area of forest in Siberia. So, Andy, I want to welcome you to the Popular Astronomy Club tonight. I will turn off my sharing, and I believe we have the screen ready for you to go.
Right. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to share my work with everyone. Wait a second here. Let me see this here. All right. There we go. There we go. All right. Is it all visible?
You can see you here.
Great. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased for this opportunity to be able to talk to you tonight. I just to say a little bit about who I am before I get into it. I'm a historian. So my talk today is going to be more about the history, the culture, the science, the history of science around the event, as opposed to a more technical discussion of what current understandings of how we explain the Tunguska explosion are, though I'm happy to talk about a little of that also in the question and answer if people are interested. So I wrote this book that came out. Here we go. I can show you it. That came out a couple years ago about the Tunguska event. This was a major explosion over central Siberia. That's widely seen today as the largest explosion, known explosion of a meteorite in modern times. But at the time, sort of eschewed understandings of what exactly meteorites were, and for the story that I'll talk about today, became a mystery. And the way I'm going to go through this is to actually kind of talk through some of the chapters in the book, talk a little bit about my main arguments, and then kind of go through the chronology of both what happened in 1908, June 1908, and what happened in the century plus afterwards to sort of understand the event. When I open the book, I ask readers to imagine coming across a scene somewhat like these pictures, where you're in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a Siberian taiga, far from everything nearby, and you come across all of these uprooted trees facing outward from a common point, with the roots showing. And to think, what would you make of it? What might you have made of it? And if you knew something about meteorites at the time, you might have thought, well, this could have been a meteorite explosion, but then you would have expected there to be a big chunk of a metallic meteorite, which was at the time thought to be the more common type. And you would have definitely thought that there might have been a crater, and there wouldn't have been. So then that kind of gives you a sense about why, one of the main reasons this event ends up becoming so perplexing. And in the book, I mean, I open with that sort of idea of let's put ourselves into it. And then I sort of talk a little bit about some of my more sort of analytical points geared towards historians, geared towards my fellow, I do what we call environmental history, where we look at human relationships with the natural world in the past. And I say this whole event really shows us the ways that mystery can have this really important role in shaping people's engagement with the natural environments that they inhabit. And when I say mystery, I mean two things. I mean mystery as something culturally imposed, something that humans kind of decide something is mysterious and ponder it over as a mystery, but also something that kind of comes from the character of the natural world itself, that there's unknown, uncertain things about the natural world that we're still getting a grasp on and probably will always get a grasp on. And that's, you know, sort of being comfortable with that part of the ability of nature to sway humans and influence humans is something we see here too. I highlight so this mystery in these three kind of dimensions. One is about the treatment of the landscape, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Another is it sort of invites the participation of what I politely call unofficial actors and alternative knowledge. These are people who are often convinced by sort of esoteric explanations, like aliens were involved in the Tunguska explosion. But then also become really important investigators of the phenomenon itself. And then also invites us to sort of look at the enigmatic complexity of cosmic disasters and the ways that, you know, natural disasters aren't only things like earthquakes and hurricanes, but also cosmic collisions as well. The approach I take is one that, so I'm also by training, a historian of Russia and the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. So I've spent a lot of, until Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I had spent a lot of time in Russia. And I really try to center the Russian and then later Soviet and Siberian story in this account. And it also intervenes in a lot of sort of debates in the historical discussions about the Soviet Union by showing the ways that some of the complexities and nuances of the culture that the people and the science and the scientists that worked within the Soviet Union. Okay, so but that's sort of some of my bigger sort of ideas in the book. Now I want to go back to 1908. And it was the morning of June 30th, June 17th, in Russia's calendar at the time, because they were still on an earlier calendar. And the blast occurs in a remote part of Siberia. You can kind of see where the black highlighted text is. And it's seen by several indigenous Evenki witnesses who were the closest to it, as well as a fair number of other people, given how remote of a location it was. This right here shows you sort of the epicenter of it. And this is not going to be hard to make out, but those yellow dots are where we actually have people's testimony from who had witnessed the event, and the like inner sort of area is where the trees were felled. I'm going to give you briefly one of the sort of more it's a long quote, but I'm not going to read it right now, but one of the more vivid accounts of an Evenki woman named Aquilina who survived the blast. And she's sort of on the side here where she was located. And immediately in the aftermath of this explosion, which fells this massive forest, uproots these trees, we have, people who do get hurt. One guy claims his shirt got burnt. Other people fell over. Akulina's husband, a man named Mechurwin, Ivan, the testimony was unclear about this for quite a while, but it's pretty clear that he breaks his arm and it gets infected and he dies in the taika, which kind of pushes
Professor
against one of these
Bruno.
sort of ideas that no one ever died in this explosion, that there's actually pretty good evidence that at least one person did die.
I can't. This is high school go.
There's also, of course, in terms of the immediate impacts of it, there's rumors that, for instance, the Japanese invaded. This was shortly after not that long after the Russo-Japanese War. There was rumors that this was God smiting the Russian people because of the 1905 revolution that had forced constitutional monarchy on the Tsar. There's also all sorts of other sort of ecological and environmental impacts, including, a herd of reindeers who supposedly get killed, though there's some ambiguity in the evidence about that, as well as potential later mutations in the ecosystem. All of that, and it's also worth pointing out that even in 1908, there was initially this thought that it was a meteorite. That came out, just weeks after. It says July 4th, but that's July 4th old date, or Russian calendar. So a couple weeks after, that was already talking about it as this thing, though, that I really sort of try to emphasize when I look at the disaster itself. And in the book, I really highlight the testimonies of people like Akulina that were collected later, is that we actually see the ways that this cosmic disaster that kind of stretches our ability to think about how people might be made vulnerable to disasters, and how social and political circumstances around them can be at play. How even in this something like an asteroid explosion, we are able to kind of see social impacts affecting the outcomes of the blast itself. Things like Russian conquest of Siberia, things like the behavior amongst reindeer herders and who was in this territory at the time, exposed some people and kept other people away from the territory. Okay, then I move on. So there's a big gap in this story. There was some work that happens to try to understand the event, some work of the scientists right after, including and internationally, and including some local seismologists. But really, it's kind of a forgotten event until the 1920s, when this one intrepid meteorite specialist named Leonid Kulik decides that this is a really important event, and he needs to go and figure out what happened there. And he begins these arduous journeys to try to get to the Tunguska site and investigate it. And these involve a series. He first tries in the very early 20s in 1921. He doesn't get there. He tries to get funding, and only in 1927 is able to make it a second attempt and actually does find the site of the meteorite fall, and then starts another expedition, was able to get more funding for an expedition in 1928. In these expeditions, he relies on the knowledge of indigenous peoples. He has to do all sorts of finagling to get himself even to the site itself, in terms of taking boats and carrying lots of supplies. Part of what actually happens in the third expedition, the 1928 expedition, is he goes undersupplied, tries to stay out there all summer by himself, after many of the people on the expedition get scurvy and have to evacuate. In this moment of evacuation, the whole expedition becomes this sort of both nationwide in the Soviet Union and international sensation, where there's these stories about, hey, there's this meteorite scientist out in the taiga looking for this meteorite and he can't find it, and now he needs to be rescued because he's been so persistent and gone out there. And this is, I'd say, sort of like about 1928 is when Tunguska goes from being something that was just sort of forgotten about to becoming an international mystery. Because it's already known at that point that he got to the center, this epicenter, and didn't locate a chunk of metal on the ground or a crater. After Gulick comes back from the 1928 expedition, though, he's not done. He capitalizes on the celebrity that had just been acquired by there being these sort of sensationalized coverage of him being needing to be rescued, to plan a larger expedition from 1929 and 1930 that was going to focus on trying to use any and all means to solve the mystery of of Tunguska. So this is things like scouring for magnetic items, geodesic analysis, drilling, draining wetlands, collecting samples, gathering eyewitness testimony, and attempts at an aerial survey. There's this one place called they call the Susla Funnel, where he has a team of workers essentially try to drain the entire divot that he thinks must be a meteorite crater. And when they drain it, there's a tree stump at the ground, which gives pretty clear evidence that it couldn't have been caused by a meteorite. These whole expeditions, though, in the 1929 and 1930 ends up being rife with conflict. Some of the people who Gulick hires to help him with it sour on the expedition, carving poems cursing Gulick into the trees at the expedition site. He turns against some of the other scientists as well, including this guy, Igor Ostapovich, who's using some of his materials back in St. Petersburg or Leningrad at the time, and Yevgeny Klinov, who later becomes a major meteorite scientist. And he fires him in the middle of it because Klinov questions Gulick's ideas about where the meteorite might be. But Gulick ends up being persistent and continues in the 1930s. After 1930, there's no expeditions that's quite as big, but there are several attempts that are made, and finally in 1938, they are able to do an aerial survey of the territory. They plan a large expedition for 1941, but as many people know, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union that year. Gulick is 58 years old and enlists in the Red Army immediately, but gets captured and dies in a POW camp. And obviously no expedition happened that year. This is so after the Second World War is when the Tunguska story takes a different turn. And that's where fiction and fantasy kind of become another method of trying to solve the mystery. There's a lot of important context going on here. The advent of the nuclear age, the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. The merging Cold War, later on, sort of the enthusiasms of the space age help give life to some of the fantastic interpretations. As well as, and I think this is important and sometimes appreciated, is that the Soviet Union at this point had a large population of young, educated people. So people who had gone through, were now literate and had gone through and had some formal of education and were kind of interested in a lot more topics like kind of adjacent to science than they ever had been before, even though they end up being very attached to theories about UFOs and things like that. And I also argue that, of course, the place that the site of the scene of the explosion plays a role in helping foster some of these fantastic theories about it. The main figure here is this science fiction writer named Alexander Kazantsev, who first proposes this idea that he's thinking about what might have caused Tunguska. And he thinks through it and says, well, it must have been an above ground explosion if there's no crater, no meteorite found. Could there have been a uranium meteorite or something like that? No, that's not really plausible. Well, then how could there have been an explosion that would have been that powerful? It must have been a nuclear explosion. And how could that have happened in 1908? Well, it must have been a crash of an interplanetary spaceship operating on nuclear power. And he writes a short story that appears in early 1946, January 1946, that kind of has two fictional scientists talking about their different ideas, and it ends with this notion. Notably, the New York Times picks this up on April 1st, 1946, and I don't think it was just an April Fool's Day joke, and it treats Kazantsev's fictional story as if it was a genuine hypothesis. And Kazantsev himself sort of soon turns to saying, actually, I didn't just mean this as a story. I meant this as something to be considered, and maybe we should go do more research on it. He stages this show at the Moscow Planetarium that gives further voice to the scenario. And it immediately sparks widespread interest amongst many people in the Soviet Union, as well as other sort of variants of sort of theories that involve alien spaceships that operate on nuclear power. And this, of course, kind of really changes the whole Tunguska history from there on out. Tunguska plays a really important role in the rise of Soviet ufology. One of the main people who was involved in the planetarium show is this guy, Felix Zeigel, who later becomes the sort of founder of Soviet UFO studies. It also leads to all sorts of sort of endless permutations and hypotheses that kind of go in this direction that are sometimes called technogenic explanations, including things like an American writer theorized that it was Nikola Tesla's death ray that he was experimenting with in 1908 that might have caused Tunguska. It also becomes a main source of science fiction, some of it quite bad, some of it quite celebrated, things like the Strugatsky's brothers and Vladimir Sorokin, who are some of the most prominent, who are extremely prominent and well-respected writers in the Soviet Union, and then even people like Thomas Pynchon, who is even more international. But then there's also sort of campy documentaries and lowbrow stuff as well. The other part, though, about Kazantsev's idea is that it doesn't end in the pages of fiction. It inspires a cohort of amateur or voluntary researchers to go and try to figure out whether they think that Kazantsev's idea might have any legs to it. This happens not right after the war, not in the early 50s, but in the thaw period under Nikita Khrushchev, where there's more openness. It happens after the Sputnik moment when the Soviets launched the first satellite. And it happens with these researchers who, had been interested in things like telepathy and other sort of kind of esoteric ideas. And they learn about the Tunguska event and they say, what we should do is go out and see if there's actually a spaceship there or any evidence of it. And one of these main groups is this group that they call them, based out of Tomsk in Siberia, that calls themselves the Complex Amateur Expedition. And they start going out to the Tunguska site in 1959 and continuing year in, year out afterwards. In the slide here, I have a picture of the first expedition, and I got a chance to meet two of the people in that photo in 2018. They've both now passed while I was doing this research. There's also a very interesting moment here where there's this collaboration between these voluntary researchers and sort of the official meteorite specialists within the Soviet Union. They often are fighting with each other, but they also engage in simultaneous expeditions, and at some point kind of reach a mutual understanding where the amateurs will do their work and the professionals will do their work. You know, the amateurs more looking for evidence of a nuclear blast, and the professional meteorite specialists looking for other ideas, including the possibility that was a comet. So the professional meteorite specialists in part respond to the lack of a crater and the lack of meteoritic material with this idea that perhaps it was a comet that evaporated and caused the explosion. And for a variety of reasons, they feel that this can help explain the blast better than what they would have been their understanding of a meteorite at the time. The voluntary expedition, members of voluntary expeditions also engaged in their own set of research. So one thing is that at very first they find that there is an increased radioactivity at the site. Now, that ends up being a combination of nuclear fallout, because this is the early 60s, so there's a lot of tests going on, and the radioactive profile of the Siberian traps, which is the sort of bedrock of where this territory is. It's different than other parts of Siberia, so it was it was an easily explained anomaly that they detected. But they do go about measuring radioactivity. They chart the tree fall meticulously to try to unearth different patterns. So the whole idea that this is a butterfly pattern comes from the voluntary expeditions, that the tree falls is shaped in a butterfly pattern. They take peat and soil samples that are then later used by other researchers who look at first for metallic microspherules, but then also for rare earth elements later on. They look for genetic anomalies, in particular in pine needles and ants, thermoluminescence in tree samples, and search for geomagnetic anomalies. And they come to have this idea that the landscape will help us solve the mystery. The trees, in particular, tree ring analysis, things like this will help us solve the mystery. This whole sort of experience of these expeditions is really interesting from the standpoint of the cultural and social history of the Soviet Union, because you see this subculture emerge amongst these hundreds of Siberian students who, so it starts off as a group of 12, but then they start recruiting people, the leaders of this group start recruiting people every year, and they go on these annual expeditions through into the 1980s and even into the 1990s. And they develop their own literature, their own sort of ways of being in the taiga, their own art and literature, as well as in general, this experience comes to play an outsized role in how these people feel and think about spending time in the natural environment. And, we see everything like particular relationships with different species, everything from hating the mosquitoes and forest flies to loving the chipmunks and being enthralled by bears, even though they occasionally killed them. The romance of campfires and hiking, and the particular ways that they had about carrying provisions. They produced these own sort of magazines, as well as hundreds of poems about their experiences on these expeditions. I also make a point about how you see particular interesting parts of gender dynamics within and ethnic dynamics and class dynamics within Soviet subcultures on these expeditions. And then also there's an important story here about the role that Communist Party connections play. So a lot of the leaders of these voluntary expeditions were party members, which meant that they were of a very elite status within the Soviet Union. They often kind of had back channels discussing things with the KGB, but that didn't stop them from at other times being accused of being an anti-Soviet group that was connected to dissidents and seen as undesirable by authorities as well. Okay, so another part of this whole story, though, is what happens in the that brings together the various groups researching Tunguska in starting in the 1960s and 1970s, and that's this campaign to protect the area. And I think this is a very interesting moment because we see mystery solving as having a being a distinctive rationale for nature protection and conservation, very different than like, well, that's a really beautiful lake, or that's has a very important species. It's the idea that something happened here that is of cosmic significance, and that's why we need to maintain the crime scene, if you will. That the thing that also happens is that there does begin to be geological prospecting nearby in the 1970s and 1980s, and you get these just absolutely vociferous calls to create a nature reserve, which eventually succeeds in it succeeds in part in the late 1980s, and then it becomes a permanent nature reserve in the 1990s, and it's still that today. There's also some really interesting things about the history of nature conservation internationally that we see here. The ethos of the people who are advocating for a nature reserve mixes it mixes sort of left and right ideologies very interestingly. These are Communist Party members, in some ways arch leftists, but they're drawing on these like class of civilization ideas and concerns about technology outracing human moral development and things like that. You also see an interesting role in the history of indigenous peoples and nature conservation. In some ways, very similar in that, like, there wasn't all that much consultation with the indigenous population about whether they wanted a nature reserve. But also, they do things like have the first director of the reserve be an Evenki man. Okay. The final chapter of the book, and I've gone through it relatively quickly just because I wanted to make sure there's time for questions and not keep you too long with the snowstorm, but I'm very happy to go through and talk about any issues I've talked about or too quickly here. But the final chapter is I step back and look at the sort of more international conversation about Tunguska that goes through the present and through the past and into the present. And there's very interesting story here about the ways that sometimes international and foreign science was leading the charge. Sometimes it was going hopelessly astray. Sometimes there was convergence on the similar idea. Sometimes there was wild ideas. So things like the Nikola Tesla idea, or even sort of more mainstream ideas like maybe it was maybe it was an antimatter or a miniature black hole. These things come from foreign scholars who are very disconnected from the place and the Soviet research going on at the time. By the late, and of course, the Soviet Union closed this site to international researchers until the 1980s. There were some attempts in their 30s of international teams to come and try to get there, but in general, there was no in-depth place-based field work going on involving international researchers until the 1980s. The first group there's a Japanese group that comes in, I think, 88 or 89. And then soon after, you get this group of Italian researchers out of the University of Bologna who do these many, many expeditions into the 1990s and 2000s. NASA invites sends a few people over there, but not too much. But they do a lot more computer modeling work starting in the 80s and into the 90s. And Tunguska becomes a very important thing in the science of near-Earth objects more broadly. International Asteroid Day is June 30th, commemorating Tunguska. A lot of the theories about planetary defense and the likelihood of needing to prepare for an asteroid collision are deeply, sort of use Tunguska as a model of a sort of medium-sized event where we'd want to do something, but where Armageddon isn't coming. Um, and that's, yeah, so that, I mean, so it's played this very important role. The international research has played this in the international research on asteroids, Tunguska has played a very important role. The theories about Tunguska itself, though, have kind of come back to the sort of mainstream view. So if there was, the main view at first was that it was a meteorite. Then they didn't find what they expected to find a meteorite in the 1930s. And that led to all sorts of theorizings, both things like aliens, but also things like maybe it was a comet. Now the understanding of airburst explosions of stony asteroids is such that it completely fits within current understandings to think that this was likely, 30 to 60 meters in diameter, a stony asteroid object, possibly a carbonaceous one, that exploded over Siberia. And the things that would seem mysterious, like there not being remnants, can mostly be explained by it being washed away. Now, there's still efforts to go find it. There was this Lake Zapovedny in the Tunguska Nature Reserve, where a few years ago there was an effort to try to say, well, maybe we can find some remnants here. But even to this day, there's not been any material that's been found that has been conclusively showed that this had to be cosmic material from 1908. There's been stuff that's been cosmic material. There's stuff that's dated to 1908, and even some cosmic material from 1908, but not such a sufficient amount of it to be able to claim that they found it. That said, it's unlikely that they're going to find it, and as many people think, because of that it would have been washed away. In the conclusion of the book, I briefly allow myself to sort of ponder the significance of this event in light of the environmental perils we face today, things like climate change and species loss and other natural disasters. And I think that one of the real interesting things about this story, in doing so, I highlight the fact that I was not actually able to walk around the site. This image up here, where is the closest, that's the epicenter of the Tunguska blast below me. But I was in a helicopter, but we weren't able to land. And it was because there were forest fires that year that got worse the next year. And there's this photo that went around the international media with this girl in a face mask. And then by the time I'm writing the book, it was in the middle of COVID and we're all wearing face masks. But all of this is to say, though, that the thing that I took from the Tunguska story for thinking about the precarities that the world faces today, environmental and otherwise, is that it actually shows how, even something that stretches our ability to think about disasters, such as an asteroid explosion, is something we've lived with. And it really actually makes me feel more like we should embrace being embedded in a particular planet than sort of indulge in escapist fantasies like colonizing Mars and things like that. I think that it emphasizes the ways that the planet has had been through more and been more connected to the cosmos than some sort of theories and ways of thinking about it have emphasized. And with that, I will turn it over for questions. So thank you.
Do we have any questions here or questions from anybody online? I do have one question that I'm curious about. If someone were to go there today, not really knowing about that, would there be any evidence there that you would notice traveling through that area or flying over it that would indicate something happened there more than 100 years ago?
That's a great question. And the answer is actually very little. So, I mean, there's the infrastructure of the later expeditions that would obviously like help people give it away. There's some sort of monuments there, but the forest itself has completely regrown. Even the trees that were all knocked down have mostly decomposed at this point. So it would take someone pretty knowing what to look for to find the places where there's still evidence of the blast in the landscape itself.
I think you might have to study maybe the trees and realize that area where there's no trees older than 100 years or so.
Yeah, well, absolutely. There's absolutely traces in like tree rings and stuff like that. So the old trees, there's very much evidence that something catastrophic happened in 1908. But you wouldn't get that from just observing it.
Has there been any development or people living in that area now?
Not really, no, because they made it a nature reserve. No one lives in or very few people, people temporarily inhabit it, but very few people live right by it. The town of Vanavara, which was a trading post when the event occurred, has a population of a few thousand, but that's it, and that was already sort of settled beforehand.
We've been studying what's happened at Tunguska for some time. We've had a couple of talks on the subject as well. One thing, though, that I didn't realize, that studying for radioactivity in the area, and again, you said this was about the 1950s, they studied for the radioactivity, and that's probably because of nuclear bomb tests and other things that might have been higher, but also is the soil in that area naturally higher in radioactivity than the rest of the Siberia?
I mean, less the soil itself than the bedrock, but yeah. So below the soil, but yeah.
So it's a natural high radioactivity in the area to start with, even before.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I have one. Did it explode because it was not metallic, so it couldn't go through the atmosphere? And it was kind of rocky and not very dense, so when it hit the upper sides of the atmosphere, it blew up. Could that be the reason?
Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of in the middle is what the issue is. Of course, tons of meteoritic material falls on the surface every day. Most of that is from rocky material that disintegrates and just kind of comes down as dust. It was a big enough body that it entered the atmosphere and got close to it, but then as it was getting closer, the counter pressure sort of flattened it. I mean, the main sort of theory is that the counter pressure flattens it, kind of turns it into a pancake, and it bursts that way. If it had been a metallic body of a similar size, it would have landed.
It probably would have been more destructive because all the kinetic energy would have been transferred into heat energy and could have been more devastation.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it would have left a huge crater, and it would have. I mean, it would have been more devastating, but it also would have had quite different effects in terms of if it left a big crater there. It wouldn't have done the same pattern of the trees. It would have been quite a bit more destructive. It would not. It would not be what they call globally significant. It'd be regionally significant, though. It would be something not quite akin to the meteorite crater in Arizona, but something somewhat like that, but not something that would, not like the KT extinction event either.
But it would have sent dust into the air and maybe affected the weather for a few years?
Possibly, I'm not sure about I don't know enough to know whether it would have reached high enough to have affected the weather globally or not, like a volcanic eruption. I'm not quite sure on that, but obviously if it was a big enough object, it would have.
Thank
Okay, do we have other questions? Okay, if everybody's questions are answered then. Professor Bruno, we thank you very much for the interesting and informative talk tonight. Glad to
Thank
have
you so much.
Okay, I think we will move on then. One thing to note, we're going to talk about, just have to get my screen back on here. Okay, we're not advancing here. Figure that out somehow. Here we go. Let's talk about what we have coming up for our public outreach programs this year for the Popular Astronomy Club. I will say one other thing, show it to the people here at Butterworth, and maybe you can see it from my screen online too. Our Skywatch article was in the newspaper, and actually both of them, the Dispatch Argus and the Quad Cities Times this morning. And the article talks about what we're going to be doing during this coming year, particularly the solar observing, which will be coming up on April 8th. You'll look on your screen now, you should be able to see our public outreach programs. Moline Library will have a Project Next Generation program coming up on January 29th. Looking forward to our first Niabi Zoo public observing session of the year on March 16th at the zoo, of course. And we will also be doing another Moline Library program talking about the upcoming eclipse a few days before the eclipse. Another one will be occurring at the Rock Island Library. April 8th will be our big day for viewing the solar eclipse, and we will have our mobile observatory and a few other telescopes with solar filters on ready to observe the partial eclipse here in the Quad Cities area. We will continue our Niabi Zoo third Saturday sessions throughout the year until November, and have another one at the Moline Library. They like to do some astronomy observing there. We'll have John Deere Middle School, as we have in the past years, continuing with that. We will be going to the Linewood Campground again in late June, or if it rains then, early July again. Bishop Hill has asked us to tentatively come out. They don't have that planned yet, but if they do, it will be on July 5th, which will be near a new moon date. So we'll have some good observing out there in Bishop Hill. Silvis Library has a big centennial celebration coming up on July 11th or 18th. They're still deciding which one to have it. And of course, later in the year, we will be going out to Riverdale schools again. Also, we'll have some of our public meetings. Obviously today, we've just heard from Dr. Andy Bruno about the Tunguska event. Next month, on February 12th, we will have Discarded Worlds, Astronomical Ideas That Were Almost Correct. It is by Brother Guy Consolmagno, and he is the director of the Vatican Observatory. Should be an interesting one. In March, we'll have our members present some smorgasbord talks, some small topics. Probably have several of those to present in March. In April, we will have Robert Gregory talk about solar flares and Neptune's clouds and chemistry. Of course, that is also the same day as we will be having the solar eclipse public viewing. The eclipse obviously has to happen during the day, and our program will be at that night. In May, we will have one program called Keep Looking Up, One Sky, One World by Dave Weinberg. We have a couple other events coming up. The North Central region of the Astronomical League will have the convention in Green Bay, Wisconsin in May. In June, the Mid-States region will have their conference in Ashland, Nebraska. And the big one, the Astronomical League Conference, will be in Kansas City, Missouri, July 17th through 20th. And there's additional information on all of these programs if you check with your PAC newsletter that you should have just received recently, or you can find links to that. If it's not already there, our newsletter should be on our website within a few days. It just came out. Later in the year, we have our picnic corresponding with the Perseid meteor shower on August 10th, and we'll have an annual banquet this year on October 12th. We are going to move on today. Usually we have some member observations, and I see looking out the window, the snow is coming down pretty seriously here at Butterworth right now. But we are going to talk about one thing. We have the library telescope, which some of you are aware of. The Astronomical League can provide a telescope to some libraries that have it available for checkout to the library patrons. And we were the recipient of one of them for this year, and we have it here. And one of our members, Megan, is going to say a few words about it.
So I took it home, I tried it out when the sky was actually clear, which was only about 2 days. So having the adjustable scope on there definitely is a must. I think if we ever do any more for a library as well, that I think was fantastic. I had my husband try it as well, being that he has zero, knowledge of a telescope. And even he was able to figure it out and use it. The only thing is, though, I had to keep telling him to stop touching it and stop leaning on the table. Because he would get it focused and then he would lean on the table and he'd like, I lost it. I'm like, touch the table. But other than that, I thought it was great. I actually did the winter Messier with it. I did not complete it, but I kind of used that list to try to find things with the star wheel, and then of course an app. And I was actually able to, with that, find about a quarter to a third of the winter Messier. So, I mean, and I was able to zoom in on things. So it's a very, very good telescope. I think it's a great one for a library use. So even if they don't even look at, like if they lose the instructional booklet, it's still very just point look, very easy to use. So very happy.
Thank you, Megan. And some of you are aware we are looking at both this telescope and the possibility of obtaining additional ones that could be provided to the local libraries here around the Quad Cities area. Yes, we take a few minutes here. Do we have any member observations you would like to present tonight? Anybody online? Aaron, are you there tonight? I couldn't see the list from here. Was Byron there?
I don't think so.
I don't know, you usually have some good observations, but as Megan already mentioned, it's been pretty cloudy this past month, and not much of us, there hasn't been much of anything to see out there. Okay, does anybody else have anything else to bring up tonight?
Mention something about the call thunder.
Oh, yeah, well, we are working with the scout group at the Loud Thunder Observatory. And we have done an analysis of what they need. We have presented that information to them. We know what needs to be obtained, what we might have to do and work to accomplish that. And there are some parts that may be needed once we do some checkout of the equipment there. So we're progressing along with that, and we're hoping to have that available to them early in the scouting season.
Well, when I talked to him, I told him that, you know, we're gonna kind of wait till Mother Nature does her thing over the winter, and then when we can get out there and we'll set up a date where we can get out there and really go through everything and let them know exactly what needs to be done and how we want, what we need to do. So then they'll know what it's gonna cost them. So. But we need to check those motors out. Each individual one for. And if one of them's bad, the gal gotta be replaced, if you're not repairable. And they don't have parts to fix those anymore.
There's some older equipment out there, but
And
we
they have
think we should be able to get them working this year, have some good astronomy programs for the scouts, but it will take some work and for their equipment.
And when I
If it
talk
does
to,
need to be replaced, it will be some expense on their part.
when I talk to the people at Home Dome, they actually looked it up and found when they sold Loud Thunder, that observatory.
Oh,
So they have all that information.
they have the information, they just don't have replacement parts.
Yeah, and just replacement part for you. Too old.
That can happen.
Yep.
Okay, any other information for tonight? I do want to remind everybody, there are still several who have not renewed your membership, which we started doing that at the annual banquet. That's a couple months ago. So if you haven't renewed your membership, it's time to do it now. Hope to keep you with us for another year here. Okay, well, if that's it, I think we're going to draw this to a conclusion tonight. Thank you all for coming here at Butterworth, and I think there were about 29 of us online too that we saw tonight. So very good meeting. I learned a lot. I was interested in that. I know I've heard about the Tunguska event on and off for a while. Interesting to hear a little bit more detail about it tonight. So remember, our next meeting here will be on February 12th. So I'll let everybody get out into the snow tonight. Hopefully make it home safely. And remember to keep looking up.
It's snowing.